The true history of the world is rarely found within the pages of published treaties or the transcribed transcripts of presidential addresses. It resides instead in the classified folders, pale yellow with age, stored in climate-controlled vaults beneath bureaucratic headquarters. Places where the air is eternally cool, still, and heavy with the scent of recycled paper and polished brass. This is the history defined not by marching armies, but by the crisp, decisive sound of a rubber stamp settling onto a top-secret executive order, executed far from the noise of public accountability. Our investigation plunges into this deepest stratum of secrecy, examining 5 pivotal decisions, each rendered in sterile, windowless rooms by committees whose very existence was compartmentalized. These were not moments of grand strategy debated in the light of day, but silent, surgical choices made under the profound shadow of global competition. Choices that quietly, irrevocably reshaped borders, economies, and the very concept of technological equilibrium. We must peel back the institutional silence that enveloped these moments, where the fate of nations was sealed by the simple act of sealing an envelope. Decision 1. The Architect's Mandate. The time was a tense, indeterminate juncture following the immediate post-conflict scramble. Global powers had stabilized politically, but were engaged in a subterranean race for future supremacy. The setting was unremarkable, a specialized annex within a sprawling defense complex, designed to appear indistinguishable from a standard procurement facility. Inside, the conference room walls were paneled in a matte, sound-dampening acoustic tile, absorbing not just noise, but any echoes of doubt. The light fixtures cast a dull, yellowish illumination, emphasizing the gravity of the leather-bound dossiers stacked neatly at each place setting. The core problem presented to the assembly, a small, highly specialized council of technical experts, economists, and retired military strategists, was simple. How to ensure technological dominance, not just for the next decade, but for the next century, using funds that could not, under any circumstance, be scrutinized by legislative bodies or international auditors. The chosen mechanism was elegant in its brutal simplicity, the clandestine allocation of vast, unchecked resources toward a foundational infrastructure program. The initial funding proposal, a document so thick it required 2 hands to lift, was meticulously dissected. It was camouflage perfection. Within the hundreds of pages detailing mundane expenditures for troop provisioning, standardized vehicle maintenance, and routine defensive upgrades, lay a single, deliberately vague line item. Hidden deep within the Contingency Research and Development section, a single astronomical figure was authorized. A figure that, when measured against the total defense budget, appeared almost negligible, but which, when isolated, represented an unprecedented pool of capital. This was money designated not for weapons, but for the invisible architecture of the future. The sensory details of that night emphasized the scale of the decision. The air conditioning hummed relentlessly, masking the faint scent of ozone produced by the early cryptographic machinery operating in the adjacent vault. On the massive oak table, the polished surface reflecting the faces of the committee members like dark glass, rested a series of precise micro-etched schematics. These were the blueprints for the foundational infrastructure, the long-haul fiber-optic conduits buried beneath oceans and deserts, the initial orbital array positioning charts, and the architectural plans for the first true computational centers. Cavernous, temperature-controlled facilities that would house the engines of modern data processing. The consensus was reached swiftly, almost chillingly so. There was no debate about the morality or transparency, only the methodology of implementation. The final signed executive order, thick parchment stamped with the seal of absolute secrecy, was slipped into a custom-made metal sleeve, its edges cold to the touch. The decision mandated a constant, non-negotiable infusion of resources designed to build a technological bedrock so deep and pervasive that any later competitor attempting to catch up would face an insurmountable structural deficit. The consequence, unseen by the public for decades, was the quiet cementing of global technological supremacy. This singular decision created the scaffolding for the modern digital age, allowing one block to dictate the standards, the security protocols, and the fundamental operational parameters of nearly every major interconnected system worldwide. The money, disguised within defense budgets, quietly created the digital highways and informational choke points that define geopolitical power today. It was a technological preemptive strike, carried out entirely in the silence of a bureaucrat's annex, leaving behind only the echo of the air conditioning unit and the faint, coppery scent of freshly signed ink. Decision 2. The elevation of vision. The progression from investing in infrastructure to dominating the vantage point was swift and logical. Decision 2 focused on achieving total informational asymmetry through the precise, almost surgical implementation of wide-area, high-altitude surveillance technologies. The environment for this decision was radically different from the bureaucratic stillness of the first. This meeting took place in a temporary, high-security communications facility carved into the side of an arid mountain range. The location was chosen for its geographical isolation and unobstructed access to nascent tracking antennae. The atmosphere inside the control room was one of nervous, accelerated activity. Cables snaked across the concrete floor, bundled and taped down, smelling faintly of rubber and plastic insulation. The dominant feature of the room was the wall of monitoring screens, early prototypes employing cathode ray tube technology, their glass faces slightly convex. The initial presentation was startling in its clarity. Existing aerial reconnaissance was expensive, localized, and vulnerable. The proposed solution was radical, a sustained, persistent orbital platform capable of instantaneous, wide-area imaging and signal collection. This required pushing the boundaries of material science, propulsion, and imaging technology simultaneously. The committee was composed of aerospace engineers, communications specialists, and military intelligence analysts. They were gathered to approve the immediate, non-reversible shift of all strategic surveillance assets to this new, unseen vantage point. Visualize the scene, the cold, flickering green light emanating from the early monitoring screens. These devices displayed rudimentary terrain maps, still drawn on obsolete paper charts mounted nearby. Then, with the activation of the new prototype system, the screens would flicker, resolving into grainy but recognizable photographic clarity. The moment was palpable. Topographical features previously obscured by cloud cover or natural shadow were instantly rendered obsolete. This was due to the orbital vantage point secured in the dead of night. One key sensory detail defined the room: the incessant, high-pitched whine of the early processing units. These machines struggled interpreting and transmitting massive quantities of digital data from geosynchronous orbit. The air was dry, and the temperature was kept low to protect the sensitive equipment, giving the room a brittle, sterile chill. Analysts, dressed in drab functional jumpsuits, moved with a specific hushed urgency, their faces illuminated only by the phosphorus glow of the monitors. The mandate went beyond mere observation. It required the creation of an operational doctrine that treated the entire globe as a single, permanently visible theater. The key document signed was an operational decree, a manual outlining protocols for data interception and encryption standards. Most critically, it included the absolute non-attribution clause protecting the source of the intelligence. Every piece of derived information had to appear to come from ground sources, weather data or publicly available intelligence. This forever masked the true comprehensive eye watching from above. The consequence of Decision 2 was the sudden, profound undermining of strategic concealment for any nation lacking similar resources. Borders became conceptual lines on a screen, and once safe harbors and covert movements were exposed to constant, silent monitoring. This decision created the era of persistent observation, fundamentally changing how wars were planned and deterrence was managed. It was based on a technology the public would not know existed for another full generation. It was the birth of true strategic omnipresence, secured with the scratch of a pen and the hum of cooling fans in a hidden bunker. Decision 3. The knot in the fiscal engine. Following the chaos of global conflict, the victorious powers faced a paradox. Military dominance was established, but economic instability threatened to undo the fragile peace. The challenge was to create a durable international economic structure that promoted trade and recovery. This structure had to ensure that the stabilizing mechanism remained tethered inexorably to a single, controlling fiscal engine. This secret meeting, unlike the others, did not take place in a fortified bunker, but in an atmosphere of contrived, decaying elegance. The location was a forgotten countryside hotel, miles from any major metropolitan center, chosen specifically for its isolation and the reliable density of its soundproofing. Known only to a handful of high-ranking diplomats and financial technocrats, the establishment was a monument to the previous century. It had heavy, dark oak doors and windows draped in thick velvet curtains that smelled faintly of dust and moisture. The critical negotiations occurred over 3 intense days in a salon characterized by its opulent yet slightly worn furnishings. Sunbeams, thick with slow-moving dust motes, pierced the gaps in the curtains, illuminating the mahogany conference table set for the representatives. The atmosphere was formal, tense, and almost entirely focused on abstract concepts of liquidity, reserves, and exchange rates. On the table, silver trays held heavy crystal water glasses and matching silver inkwells. These artifacts of a bygone diplomacy were now used to notarize the architecture of modern global finance. The decision being forged was the secret consensus on establishing a convoluted financial framework. The public declaration of the summit would later focus on currency stabilization and debt relief. The clandestine agreement established a system wherein major national currencies were functionally pegged to a specific dominant currency standard. This occurred through a complex web of reserve requirements and lending protocols, reached behind those heavy oak doors. This structural mechanism ensured stability by irrevocably linking national destinies to a single fiscal engine. The negotiation was characterized by the rustle of meticulously printed economic charts and graphs, detailing projected currency flows and national solvency metrics. The language used was highly technical, deliberately opaque, minimizing the political visibility of the profound surrender of economic sovereignty that was taking place. The key agreement revolved around the creation of a centralized international economic body, granted unprecedented veto power over certain national monetary policies. A power wielded discreetly, through conditionality and lending criteria, rather than overt command. A sensory detail central to this decision was the distinct, satisfying sound of the heavy oak doors closing. It was a solid, muffled thud that cut off all external noise, creating an internal echo chamber where the only audible sounds were the scraping of chairs, the occasional cough, and the rhythmic scratching of fountain pens against high-quality cotton paper. This isolation reinforced the severity of the commitment being made, a quiet pact to manage global wealth flow from a central, non-elected position. Decision 3 institutionalized the concept of global economic interdependence under a specific set of rules written by a limited few. It stabilized international trade and fostered post-war recovery, but it simultaneously rendered smaller economies perpetually dependent on the central fiscal health of the dominant power. The decision, notarized in the quiet, dusty elegance of a forgotten hotel, fundamentally rewired the flow of capital, ensuring that prosperity and crisis alike would propagate throughout the linked system, according to the mechanics set forth in that initial secret charter. Decision 4. The depths of strategic silence. If the land was mapped from orbit and the economy was locked into an interdependent grid, the final frontier of strategic control lay beneath the surface of the world's oceans. Decision 4 mandated the covert mapping of extensive undersea topography, a program ostensibly disguised as deep-sea research and oceanographic study, but intended truly to secure vital, unseen strategic pathways critical for naval and resource dominance. The setting for the initiation of this program was a cramped, cold naval planning room overlooking a perpetually gray harbor. Its glass window panes beaded with condensation from the damp maritime air. The space smelled strongly of salt, diesel fuel, and old blueprints that had absorbed the humid atmosphere. The walls were covered not in abstract charts, but in highly detailed navigational maps, their plasticized surfaces worn smooth from countless points and revisions. The mandate focused on bathymetry, the measurement of ocean depths, and the precise charting of continental shelves, deep ocean trenches, and, critically, the subsurface geological features that influenced acoustic propagation. For surface traffic, oceans are highways. For the silent, strategic movement of submerged assets, they are labyrinths defined by temperature layers, current shifts, and geological masking features. Mastery of this subsurface domain required absolute high-resolution data. The specialized equipment developed under this mandate was substantial. We can visualize the immense, heavy reels of spooled metal cable used to deploy deep-rated sensors, designed to withstand the crushing pressure of the abyssal plain. These sensors, operating on highly classified low-frequency acoustic pulses, meticulously mapped the contours of the ocean floor, recording every ridge, canyon, and geological fault line. The resulting data streams were immense, requiring dedicated, isolated processing facilities. The documents sanctioning this expenditure and operational directive were classified under the blanket term Hydrodynamic Global Stability Initiative. The true purpose was clear to the small committee of naval engineers and intelligence officers to create a comprehensive, hidden atlas of the ocean floor, marking the most secure, quietest pathways for strategic asset deployment, and simultaneously identifying potential choke points and surveillance opportunities for opposing forces. The sensory details here are defined by the environment of deep-sea technology. The rhythmic, low thrum of the research vessel's engine, barely audible through the thick hull. The eerie black imagery displayed on the console screens, showing the alien landscape of the deep ocean being rendered into precise numerical data points. The constant presence of cold, brine-laced air that seeped into every corner of the planning room. The maps being generated were not for public consumption. They were the invisible infrastructure for silent global power projection. The consequence of Decision 4 was the creation of a permanent, unseen geography of strategic advantage. This allowed for the continuous, untraceable movement of critical assets and guaranteed access to newly discovered deep-sea resources and mineral deposits. By controlling the mapping of the oceanic depths, the architects of this decision secured a crucial level of resource and military dominance that the rest of the world could only guess at. The silent charts generated in that cold harbor room became the secret border treaties of the world's vast, unpatrolled waters. Decision 5. The standardization of silence. The culmination of these geopolitical and technological power plays was nearly undone by a critical vulnerability, the fragility of communication security. Decision 5, perhaps the most urgent and reactionary of the 5, illuminates the sudden, rushed adoption of standardized decryption protocols. following a catastrophic near-miss intelligence failure that nearly escalated a global crisis into open, uncontrolled conflict. The context of this decision was immediate post-crisis chaos. The setting was a temporary communications bunker, thick concrete walls vibrating faintly with the distant tremor of city traffic, miles away. The air inside was thick, smelling of stale coffee, burnt electrical components, and the metallic tang of collective fear. Hours earlier, a misinterpreted, fragmented, and inadequately secured communication package had triggered an automatic counter-response sequence, halted only at the absolute final moment through human intervention. The failure was not one of intent, but of systemic inconsistency in communication handling. The emergency assembly, convened within the hour of the stand-down, comprised the most senior communications and cryptographic experts, their faces gray with exhaustion and shock. They were handed the raw data packets that had caused the near miss, pages and pages of confusing, contradictory, and poorly encrypted text, produced by several different allied agencies using incompatible security standards. The problem was clear. In a globally interconnected world, relying on fragmented, proprietary, and institution-specific encryption methods was a recipe for mutual destruction. The solution, hammered out in a grueling, sleepless session, was the mandate for a unified global standard for all classified state communication. A system based on shared algorithms, standardized hardware, and rigid, non-negotiable operational protocols. The scene was defined by frenetic, desperate activity. The frantic clatter of early teletype machines, competing with the low static buzz of secure phone lines. The hurried, scribbled notes on legal pads, documenting the technical specifications that would define the next 50 years of classified exchange. The signing of the emergency mandate was not a careful, measured action, but a hurried, nearly illegible scrawl on the dotted line of a document titled Emergency Communications Integrity Act. The implementation phase required the immediate cessation of all existing ad hoc encryption methods and the widespread deployment of the new standardized protocols. This meant moving mountains of dusty internal memoranda and technical jargon to justify the expense and radical operational shift. Tens of thousands of identical, thick technical manuals, bound in industrial-grade plastic and stamped with a severe, unambiguous, Level 0 clearance seal, were rushed into production. The core of Decision 5 was the centralization of information control. While the standard ensured robust security against external penetration, it also ensured that the architecture of security itself was understood, and, if necessary, controlled by a single central oversight body. This created a highly efficient mechanism for global communication and concealment, yet fundamentally altered the ability of individual actors to truly conceal their intentions from the central architect of the system. The consequence was the fundamental restructuring of how global powers communicate and conceal their intentions. Fragmentation was replaced by a rigid, effective homogeneity. The near-miss catastrophe created an intelligence framework where security and, paradoxically, centralized transparency were inextricably linked. The world avoided an accidental war, but ceded a layer of informational autonomy in the process, a silent, technical surrender. Ratified in the panicked aftermath of a failure that almost vaporized global stability. The quiet chronology. These 5 decisions, the massive hidden investment in future infrastructure, the elevation of surveillance to persistent orbital omnipresence, the locking of global currencies to a singular fiscal engine, the covert mapping of the strategic subsurface geography, and the urgent standardization of decryption protocols, form a quiet chronology of power. Each decision was made far from public discourse, rendered in rooms devoid of public input. driven by a cold calculus of geopolitical necessity and technological advantage. The atmosphere of these pivotal moments was one of clinical secrecy, the low hum of machinery, the scent of fresh printing ink, the muffled silence behind heavy doors, and the ever-present chill of air conditioning designed to preserve both the technology and the documents. These bureaucratically approved documents, often dry, technical, and impenetrably worded, did more to reshape borders, economies, and the very concept of information security
than any public declaration or televised treaty signing.
They illustrate how a handful of individuals, operating under the cloak of institutional anonymity, executed seismic shifts beneath the surface of official policy. Defining the world we inhabit today, a world constructed not by famous architects, but by the quiet, meticulous architects of the classified past.